Hola clase y bienvenidos otra vez. Hoy vamos a continuar unidad 4. Y el tema de hoy es el pretérito y el imperfecto. Okay, so today we're going to continue to talk about the past tense in Spanish. As we talked about during the last video over the imperfect, there are two past tenses in Spanish, the preterite and the imperfect. These two past tenses are very different and cannot be used interchangeably, so it's very important that we go over the rules and master those. In front of you, you should have your note guide. On this note guide in section A, you're going to see a chart where we are going to fill out the differences between the preterite and the imperfect. Okay? We will work through these together, and there's examples for you to write down on both columns. Let's first start with a short reminder on what is the difference between preterite and imperfect. Okay? Preterite is going to be the past tense that's used to describe completed actions. When you use the preterite, you're being very specific about what occurred in the past. Okay, it can be anything. Think of everything you did this morning before leaving your house. You probably got up, you brushed your teeth, you washed your face, you got dressed, etc. All of those would be preterite. The imperfect, on the other hand, is the descriptive past tense that talks generally about the past. You can use it to describe how people or places or things were, or used to be, and really you give no regard to when the action began or ended. Okay, now let's take a closer look at your left-hand column, the preterite. You'll see in the first box there, I did write you a reminder on your preterite endings. I know you haven't forgotten those due to our song. And then below you see 3 rules of when you use the preterite. Let's take a few minutes and go over each of those rules. You will always use the preterite when you're talking about completed actions in the past. Okay, so let's think of a few examples. You can say, I ate pizza for lunch, I drank milk during my lunch, and I left school at 3 o'clock. All of those are completed actions. The example sentence I want you to write down in your notes is, I ate an apple this morning. This action is done and over with, and it's very specific. To translate that, in Spanish, you would say, Yo comí una manzana esta mañana. Okay, the second time you use preterite is anytime you are talking about the beginning or the end of an action. Maybe you were talking about the movie you went to see this weekend and you said, yeah, the movie started with a really exciting scene and blah, 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 blah. Okay? Any of that, when you're going to use the word empezar or terminar, you're going to use the preterite, okay, when you're talking about a single action. Our example sentence I would like you to write down is, I started the test at 10 o'clock and I finished at 11. To translate that into Spanish, we're going to say, Yo empecé el examen a las 10 y terminé a las 11. Lastly, you're always going to use the preterite when you're talking about an interrupting action. Look at your note guide. On the left-hand side for the preterite, you see the interrupting action. And then on the right-hand side, for the imperfect, you see the action being interrupted. Okay, so those two go hand in hand. They're commonly used in sentences together. Here's one that applies. Mrs. Thompson was talking when the bell rang. Okay, so the interrupting action. What interrupted? The bell rang. So that's preterite. What was going on? Well, Mrs. Thompson was talking. Okay, that would be the imperfect. Okay, so that's what was interrupted. Here's an example sentence for you. I was eating when he called. To translate that, Yo comía cuando él llamó. Okay, so the interrupting action, what interrupted my eating? Well, he called. Therefore, él llamó is preterite. Okay, lastly, on your note guide, you see palabras claves. That means keywords. I made here a list of keywords for you that when you see these in a sentence, you can almost guarantee that that sentence should be written in the preterite tense. Okay, these words are very helpful. Let's go over what they mean. Ayer means yesterday. Anoche means last night. Anteayer, the day before yesterday. La semana pasada, el mes pasado, el año pasado mean last week, last month, or last year. Esta mañana means this morning. El lunes or martes, on Monday, on Tuesday. Okay, you're being specific, so you've got to use preterite. Hace 2 días, 2 days ago. And en 1980, in 1980, again, anytime you are specific about the year that something happened, that is preterite. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. You use the preterite to talk about completed actions in the past, and you're very specific about what happened. Let's compare that with the imperfect. You see here on your note guide in the right-hand column that I, at the top, did put your imperfect endings. Remember, I like to call the imperfect the abas and the ias. You can see why based on the endings. And we have 4 main uses. All right, let's start with habitual actions. Anytime you talk about your habitual actions in the past, you need to use the imperfect. Some examples might be, I used to go to my grandma's house every Sunday. Or, we traveled to Florida during every spring break. Those are things you did habitually or on a regular basis, and therefore you need to use the imperfect. An example sentence I would like you to write down is I ate an apple every day. To translate that, yo comía una manzana todos los días. Take a second there. Compare how that contrasts with the preterite. Look at rule number 1 under preterite and rule number 1 under imperfect. They are essentially almost the same sentence. The preterite one says, I ate an apple this morning, whereas the imperfect sentence says, I used to eat an apple every day. Okay? But because we put the word every day in there, we're implying it was habitual action, we have to use imperfect. Okay, you're also going to use the imperfect when you're describing how people or places used to be. Okay, so maybe you're describing your father and you were saying, as a child, my father was really athletic. Or maybe you're describing the scenery about or around your house when you were growing up. When I was a child, I lived on a farm. The farm was really beautiful and there were a lot of trees. Those would all be imperfect sentences. An example I'd like you to write down is the hero was very brave. That would be translated as el héroe era muy valiente. Alright, you're also going to use the imperfect to talk about the action that was being interrupted. Okay, I use the same example that I did over in the left-hand column. I was eating when he called. Remember that the imperfect is what was going on when all of a sudden the preterite comes in and interrupts it. So I was eating when he called. Eating is what was being interrupted, so that's got to be imperfect. Yo comía cuando él llamó. Lastly, you're always going to use the imperfect when you talk about time, age, or weather in the past. Here's some examples for you. It was 3 o'clock, I was 17 years old, and it was sunny. Quick reminder, remember when you're telling time, it's always the verb ser. You say es la una, son las dos, etc. When talking about age, you always use the verb tener. When you say tengo 30 años, it's kind of like saying I have 30 years. And most of your weather expressions that you learned last year in Spanish 1 started with the verb hacer. You said hace calor, hace frío, hace viento, etc. Okay, keeping those verbs in mind, how would we translate these to the imperfect tense? For it was 3 o'clock, we would say Eran las 3. I was 17 years old. Tenía 17 años. And it was sunny. Hacía sol. Okay, lastly, under the imperfect column, I would like you to go down to palabras claves. Let's go over the key words. Again, I have written a list of words for you that when you see these words in a sentence, it's telling you that the sentence needs to be written in the imperfect tense. Here's what these words mean. Todo el tiempo, all the time. Siempre, always. Nunca, never. Mucho, a lot. Muchas veces, many times. A menudo, often. Frecuentemente, frequently. Todos los días, every day. Todos los meses, every month. Todos los años, every year. For the most part, all of those key words indicate habitual actions, which is why you're going to need to use the imperfect with them. All right. Keeping those rules in mind, let's do some practice. I have written here 6 sentences that occurred in the past tense. What you need to do is read through them and then conjugate the verb in either the preterite or the imperfect. Reading comprehension is going to be very important here, so make sure you know what the sentences are saying. Let's look at number 1 together. I read 2 books yesterday. Okay, that sounds to me like a completed action, plus I have the keyword ayer. So for I read, you would have preterite leí. Please feel free to go ahead and pause me for numbers 2 through 6. Okay, let's go over our answers here. You were 8 years old when you moved. We're talking about your age. Anytime you talk about time, age, or weather, in the past, you've got to use imperfect. Your answer should be tenías. Number 3, we left at 8 o'clock at night. Okay, I left at a certain time. I was pretty specific, and this action is completed, done and over with. You need to use preterite here. Salimos. Number 4, Juan was sleeping when I arrived. Okay, so something was going on when I interrupted it. The action that's going on, that needs to be imperfect. So your answer for number 4, dormía. Number 5, my friends never used to work on Sundays. Okay, now this keyword never, it's kind of telling me habitually something I did not do. So you need to use the imperfect here. Your answer is going to be trabajaban. And number 6, it was 2:30 when I left. If you tell the time, age, or weather in the past, you've got to use the imperfect. Your answer would be eran. Okay, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to see page 208 in your textbook. Also, please write them down under section C. This is a difficult concept to really get these rules memorized and to practice with them. So please, please, please take some time, write down your questions, and we are going to spend the entire class period going over what is the difference between preterite and imperfect and can we use it. Okay?